Good evening, everyone.
Rabbi Zobin.
Nice to see you all. In order to avoid interference, I'm going to put everyone on mute. I will pause at certain points in order to allow questions if people want to ask questions, and equally, please feel free to use the chat facility if you want to ask questions. Before I go any further, I just want to mention that, as everyone is aware, very sadly, we heard the news about Bobby Hill, Binyamin ben Beraleib, who was Nifto, passed away. Now's not the right time for Hesped, and nor am I the right person to deliver Hesped. But I just want to start off by acknowledging the enormous debt as a community that we owe him, leading davening, especially on Yom Noraim for many years, his incredible decades of Hashkama Shiurim and leadership of that minyan, his general Shiurim, Tisha B'Av, the December holidays. I think thousands of hours of Torah taught by him to our community, besides being obviously an inspirational role model. So many people in the community are his Talmidim, and many people are from and part of our community today because of him. Across the wider community, he's taught Torah to thousands. He was a modest man, a man of learning, a man of exceptional eloquence and ability to speak well, a teacher of Torah, someone who was Makarev many hundreds before the word Kiruv was really known or used, whether in the United Synagogue. I think he was a minister of Watford Shul for a time, the United Synagogue Education Department, Family Week, schools, seed, study circles, so many different things. And the world is a poorer place without him, and obviously we wish Nechama to his wife Bernice, to children Avi, Rebecca, and Jeremy. And this shir should be the Iloi Nishmaso, to the Iloi Nishmas Binyamin ben Beraleib, who is quite literally irreplaceable. The topic of the shir is trying to look at some of the shilas that have arrived at my table, at my phone or WhatsApp virtual table over the last few months. I'm going to try and cover quite a lot of ground, and perhaps I'll start by saying what I'm not going to speak about. I'm not going to speak about the Pesach shilas, which were unusual this year, and I'm also not going to speak about the shilas that we still have to deal with going forward. There's clearly going to be difficult shilas to be asked about when we come back, and how we resume and what way we resume. Will we need to catch up Kriyas HaTorah and how that will work? These are all shilas that need discussion. I'm also not going to spend time now, though maybe if there's time at the end, I'll touch on it, discussing in light of the recent guidelines what policies we should be adopting. I'm taking as a given that we should follow the government guidelines, not in any way reduce those. This is for many good reasons, including Dinuz Malchusa, including the fact that in general we hope they have the best information, and therefore not to follow them would be a sakana, would be a risk. And then there's additional elements, if we don't follow them, of Eva, of creating hatred, of Chil Hashem, and other important factors like that. So I'm going to take as a given that we shouldn't do anything more lenient than they say, but there are questions about whether we should be stricter. To what degree does the government take economic factors into its consideration? Do these have halachic legitimacy or not? These are very, very interesting, deep and powerful questions. I will try and offer some guidance over the next few days in terms of garden minyanim, and other such things. I've had a number of questions already asked about people getting their cleaning helps back and haircuts and other such things. I'll simply say that I do not feel equipped and do not want to rush into making decisions about these things. They need a lot of careful reflection. The government guidelines, and I don't think I'm the first to point this out, were not entirely clear. And there's still information coming out from the government. And therefore it's wholly appropriate that time is taken to digest the information coming out and also to speak to the doctors in our own community. And I've started the process of so doing. Doctors themselves are struggling to make sense both of the guidelines and the medical situation. There's a lot that's still unknown about the whole of this epidemic. And therefore it's correct not to rush into a decision. And in the meantime, I'm convinced wholly appropriate, if it takes us a couple of days to get clarity, that is the wholly appropriate and right thing to do. And even if that means that in theory we could have started something earlier and we can't, and therefore we hold back for a few more days, it needs to be digested and considered properly. So I'm not really going to speak about that either. There are also many other shilos that maybe if I have time at the end, I'll touch upon questions about music in the sphere in the current situation, questions about people making bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs and saying Baruch Shepatrani or not being able to say them. When does one say Hagomel if one's recovered from an illness? And can one say Hagomel without a minyan? A variety of these sorts of questions. But what I want to focus on in this topic are some of the questions associated with health and finance and ethics around these times. And these are very interesting questions. They're not shilas that are covered in a regular season. They're unusual, they're challenging, they're rare, and many of them are exceptionally painful also. But these are important things to discuss, and I really just want to use this as a chance to share some of the halachic process and thinking that I've been engaged in, and many others have also been engaged in, and just try and understand collectively some of the sugyas and topics involved. The first shayla I'm going to talk about is one about triage and triage policy in hospitals. I'm going to slightly blur the details due to possible issues of confidentiality, but the question that I was asked was from a senior doctor in the broader community who had been asked by his hospital to create triage policies. The issue of triage is as follows. The sickest patients obviously require hospitalization, some in intensive care units and maybe also to be placed on respirators. And the fear at the beginning, largely, thankfully, not actualized, was that the numbers would be so great that very difficult and painful triage decisions would have to be taken, who to prioritize. And this is obviously a policy decision that needs to be put in place so that on the spur of the moment in very difficult and painful situations, doctors and other medical staff would know how to respond. And these are exceptionally painful and tragic questions, because effectively what we're saying is that some patients, in principle, may not receive sufficient life-saving support. And this can be a question of life and death. Again, thankfully, from the doctors I've spoken to, broadly speaking, these policies were not implemented. Now, the doctor who asked me was part of an NHS committee, and he was as such only one member of the committee. And equally, his voice was one voice of many, and he had to follow general guidelines that were given. Nonetheless, he asked for a halachic perspective on this matter and what would be the equations that we would use in triage. Now, the question of triage is in many respects not a new one. It's already dealt with by a Mishnah that discusses certain methods of making decisions. And it's one that occurs in any large scale or even sometimes smaller scale accident. An ambulance crew arrives on the scene of an accident, and there may be several people or many people that need treating. And the crew has to make a quick and swift decision who to treat first. So in that sense, this is a classic shaila dealt with very extensively by the poskim. However, there are a number of unique elements to this question, the way it's being asked at the moment. Firstly, unlike most triage questions, this isn't necessarily about who to treat first, but this is about the possibility of treating at all. And it's the broad policy of not making a decision to treat less or not offer certain treatments to patients who are deemed by whatever criteria one puts in place as a lower priority. And this is one element of the question. And the second element of the question is that in the triage ambulance scenario, at least, we have the two needy patients in front of us, and we're making a decision weighing up between the two who are there in front of us. In this situation, it may be a question of making a policy not to treat someone or offer someone a certain form of treatment or move them into intensive care unit or respirator, even at the moment we're leaving this sitting empty because we need to leave this empty in order to offer others the treatment opportunity, access to the equipment. And therefore this is a significantly more difficult question, because there isn't actually a patient in front of us who's competing with someone who needs the equipment. We're consciously choosing not to treat someone in order to leave supplies available for someone else. Now, just running through the criteria, The simplest case, as I said, is a triage situation where you have two patients in front of one. And here, the factors used to make a decision, both clarified by the poskim and I believe from the doctors I've spoken to, broadly in line with guidelines offered by the Western world, are that we use two rules basically. Who is in the greater immediate need? So the ambulance crew will assess who needs immediate treatment and who can on leave a little bit longer. And secondly, who will the treatment be more likely to help? In other words, there's a better chance of the interventions being offered being beneficial. So these are common sense principles, and they're reflected in halacha and in contemporary Western ethics similarly. Obviously, if one is in greater immediate need, treat them ahead of the other one. We're talking about triage when the question is who does one treat first. And the second one is who will the treatment be more likely to help? If there's a greater chance of one being successful over the other, then that's the criteria we'll use. Now, it's obvious and apparent just by thinking about these cases that there can be occasions where these two criteria will contradict each other. And the one who's at greater immediate risk is also the one whom medical intervention may be less likely to help. And these are more nuanced situations, which we're not going to go into now. But in general, the rule would be treat the one who's more likely to survive in a case of contradiction. In halacha, we also use another factor, which is terminal or non-terminal conditions. And basically speaking, we'll come to this in more detail if we have time later, but halacha would assess whether someone is chaye shar or chaye olam. Meaning to say, if they are treated, is this a treatment that will merely delay death, but ultimately the condition they currently have is already causing ongoing deterioration, which will only allow life to continue for certain fixed periods of time, or were they treated successfully, would this then restore them to chaye olam, to the possibility of long-term life? And that would normally be a factor in also making a decision. Normally we would prioritize the chaye olam, the one who has longer-term prospects over the one who has shorter-term prospects. So these are the general classic rules in triage. What we would not take into account, in principle, in and of in itself, is age. Age may be a factor in determining their general health and the likelihood of success of treatment, but in and of in itself, the number of years that life statistics would suggest to us, life expectancy statistics would suggest to us the person has left is not a factor. In the same way as we wouldn't look at profession or economic status, we wouldn't make a calculation of saying someone is elderly, statistically left years left, that has a good life. These are certainly not in and of in themselves halachically acceptable considerations. Though of course age may affect, as I said, the best estimate of the doctors of likelihood of survival. Having said that, like all general rules, there are exceptions where we would look at societal need. In a contemporary example of this might be that we would all understand that a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, would be treated differently by hospital and perhaps prioritized rather than merely being assessed in terms of the general rules of triage because of societal need. And this finds source in halacha. There's a Rashi in Horius, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, who speaks about the Kohen Moshrach Milchama, the Kohen who leads people into battle, coming first, since there's a greater need of societal needs for them to be treated. So there could be rare exceptions where someone is of such clear societal benefit that we see this as Sorach Rabim. By saving the life of this individual, we're effectively saving the lives of many, and then they would be prioritized. But this is more or less the general triage criteria when we have two patients in front of one. In a theoretical case, which I'm not sure would be common, maybe the doctors can advise if this does happen or not, if there's no determinant, nothing to determine based on the criteria above, then the poskim give different suggestions. It could be the one that's literally closer. In other words, why step over patient A to treat patient B? If they are both literally, as far as we can tell, in the same situation, treat the one that comes first to hand. It could be one can choose. It could be a lottery, randomly would be an appropriate way to decide. It could be there aren't direct halachic principles that can be applied in at least a theoretical situation where both are equally appropriate to treat. The other principle I'll say, which is also pretty clear, is that we can't take someone off a respirator once they're on, even though we think there may be someone more who would gain more by being put on it. Once they're on, to take them off would be, in most cases, direct or indirectly causing their earlier demise, and therefore this wouldn't be okay. I say generally because, with all medical situations, each case needs to be looked at by itself, and it could be that there are situations where taking them off won't immediately have an effect on them, but also in the longer term, in which case maybe it would be justified. But these are the simpler cases when someone is in front of me, and in that case, it's clear I need to use the laws of triage to make a decision who to treat first. What happens if the patient isn't in front of me? So here we can mean a number of different things. If, for example, I know that the patient exists, and I've had a call from the ambulance that the patient is 25 or 45 minutes away, then from a halachic perspective, the patient is there in front of me. And the fact that at the moment now I'm unable to treat them, obviously means I should treat the patient that I can treat now. But if I have a piece of equipment which can only be used for one or the other, and the assessment is that the patient who isn't yet literally physically here would gain more from the equipment, it would certainly make sense to prioritize that one over the patient who is here, even though one is in front of me and one isn't. Because when we talk about two patients in front of us, we don't mean geographically, literally located in the same place. We mean that we are aware of a definite need, and there are two definite needs in front of me. I'm stuck. I am only able to treat one or the other. What can I do? I need to apply the rules of triage, and therefore I would prioritize based upon the criteria you said of who the treatment is likely to be more effective. So far, so classic. So far, these are fairly mainstream and established halachas. Here the difficulty is, and this is less discussed by the poskim, what to do in a situation where I only have one patient in front of me. However, I know statistically that over the next period of time, there is likely to be other patients coming through, some of whom will be more likely some of whom for whom the intervention is more likely to be successful. So I don't have in front of me a two patients, both of whom are needing pikuach nefesh, both of whom need medical treatment, about both of whom lo samud al dam riachah, do not stand idly over the blood of my fellow human being apply. I only have one patient in front of me, and there's only one human being of whom I'm aware who my obligation as a doctor, or actually as a human being, the obligation falls upon me to treat. We'll look at this later, but in principle, doctors and everyone else are halachically pretty much the same. We all have an obligation to save lives, just the doctors are equipped to do it in a way that most of us aren't. But there's a human and medical obligation to save lives. I have in front of me a patient. I have no other patients in front of me. It's not a situation where I have two patients, and I only have the hands and the ability and the equipment and the medicine to treat one or the other, and I need to make a decision which one to prioritize. Here I only have one patient in front of me, and the other one at the moment now, I'm not even aware of at all. It's not that I know that they're 45 minutes away, and therefore it's simply a question of waiting. And I'm making, arguably, a decision to not treat one in order to preserve the limited resources I have, the equipment I have, in order to treat a second one that will come along later. And this is not a shailot that is easily answered, and not one that is found explicitly in the poskim, though they do discuss similar scenarios of how to deal with statistical odds in pikuach nefesh when there is no actual person in front of me. And the consensus that emerges, and this is spoken about by Professor Avram Steinberg, who we've had in our shul on several occasions. It's also been discussed by Rav Schechter. It's been discussed of YU, the Yeshiva of Yeshiva University. It's been discussed by Rav Osher Weiss. Many of the poskim have spoken about this in more recent times. And the broad consensus that emerges from most of the poskim is that we do view statistical likelihood that there will be another patient as a sufficient source of knowledge that out there somewhere is someone waiting to be treated, even though I don't yet know who they are, and I can't say with absolute certainty that they exist. So statistically, based upon previous experience, the odds are well above 90% that another patient will be coming in tonight who will need this equipment, and if I give it to the first patient, I won't be able to use it for the second. Nonetheless, I can't say for sure, I can't say with certainty there is someone else, but the statistics, very significant and high level of statistics, tell me that out there somewhere is someone who needs this, even though I don't actually know who they are. And this is somewhat of a consensus amongst the poskim that this is sufficient to establish rules of triage. And indeed, this was the ruling that I gave to this doctor who was setting policy in the NHS. As I said, he was only one of many, and he had other limitations on what he was and wasn't able to apply. But this is this I believe is an acceptable halachic policy. And I'll just share one Maramokum, one source for this, which is a Gemara in Baba Basra, which tells us the story of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi. Rabbi Yehuda Anossi was the editor of the Mishnah. He compiled the collection of statements of the Tanaim into the Mishnah. He was personally a wealthy person. He was also Korov L'Malchut. He was close to the Roman rulers at the time, and had considerable financial resources. And in his time, there was a famine. And even his considerable resources were unable to feed everyone. His wealth was insufficient to stretch to cover everyone who needed it. And the Gemara in Baba Basra shares with us Rabbi Yehuda Anossi's regrets after the famine was over, in which he says, I didn't marshal my resources to prioritize based upon the particular rules of triage that Gemara is discussing. I didn't marshal my resources and not feed someone who needed it now, knowing that someone else more deserving would need it, or higher priority in the triage chain would need it later. And this story indicates to us the regret of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, which is brought in Shulchan Aruch, in Hilchos Tzedakah, tells us that he was saying, I should have marshaled my resources such that I'm not using a resource now for a needy person in front of me now, because I know statistically a more needy cause will come later. Now, this is not a direct piece of evidence, because the situation there, are we talking about a situation of famine so dire that it's literally life-saving, or are we talking about a quality of life scenario? The Gemara is unclear. It does talk about meisbarav, dying in famine. Nonetheless, it's not clear if that's a literal definition, or it means it could happen. But this is a good source that seems to tell us that it is appropriate, even matters of life and death, to marshal resources, even though I don't have a recipient in front of me, based upon the statistics of knowing that there's likely to be a need later on. It's a difficult halacha to apply, but this is indeed the policies that in general were adopted triage and halachically are appropriate. I do find it interesting that Rabbi Yehuda Anossi was unable to apply this principle. And even though he knew it as a halachic principle, he said, I was mitzvah, I didn't. I gave the food that I had to the person immediately in front of me, and I wasn't able to turn them away. But that's a story in a Gemara in Baba Basra, which is somewhat of a source for paskening this question. But broadly speaking, the poskim have taken that stance. This does tie into another important halachic discussion. In general, to what degree do we see statistical pikuach nefesh as having the legitimacy of pikuach nefesh, even though there's no direct and immediate gain in front of us? And we will look at that in more detail when we look at the next two questions that we're going to move on to. But for now, I'll simply say that in halachic terms, it's not obvious that the two cases are the same. If I have an immediate person in front of me who needs medical treatment, and in that case we treat that as pikuach nefesh, as opposed to something which we think over time and in general will be a situation of pikuach nefesh. So for example, medical research. Now it is true that over time medical research saves lives. Does that mean that it should be treated as pikuach nefesh now? Very different to having someone in front of one who is directly needy and needs medical treatment, to be that as pikuach nefesh, pushing away all other almost all other halachic considerations. And on contrast, to compare that to a generic medical need, which statistically, if I engage in medical research over time, definitely we will save lives. Medical research is successful, and over time it will, we don't know which particular research project or investigation will achieve results, but we know that societally, if we embark on medical research, it will save lives. And nonetheless, it's not clear in halacha that this is treated with the same importance, because it is further removed. And just to give an example of that, it is equally true that economic development will save lives. The economy flourishing more will do better, will give greater money and greater resources, which if used appropriately, will be able to fund the NHS and other research and save lives ultimately. A building project to build roads will save lives. It will reduce traffic and allow ambulances to travel faster. There clearly comes a space at which this is too far removed. And this is a general human need as opposed to a specific medical need. And that wouldn't be given halachic weighting. This is well established by the Noda B'Yehuda, by the Chasam Sofer, by other poskim. And therefore, the exact point at which a long-term statistical benefit ceases to be an immediate pekuach nefesh is halachically complicated and somewhat relevant to the questions that we face here as to what degree is it legitimate for the government, for example, to take into account economic change in order to ease lockdown, for example. And again, we'll look at that later. But for now, just looking at our specific question, triage where there are two patients in front of me, and I have only the ability to treat one or the other at this particular junction in time. Classic halachic question. Triage where I have one person who I may be making a decision not to treat in order to marshal resources not to treat someone else who I don't yet know of their existence. Just statistically, I think it's highly likely that they will come along. More controversial, but consensus of poskim that this is also enough to justify rules of triage. So this is the first question that I wanted to share. Moving on to a second question, and a question I got from several people, were questions about what risk is one obligated to take in order to help others. And this was a subject of discussion amongst many doctors. Let me take this chance to salute our doctors, our nurses, our midwives, our medical care practitioners, some of whom tragically paid a heavy price or the heaviest price for their treatment. Now, we don't know much about, we still don't know much about the coronavirus, but it is clear that working in the hospitals gives one greater exposure and possibly also increases the severity of the case, depending on what one's view is about viral loads, and therefore if one has is there a difference between if one has a significant exposure as opposed to trivial amounts of exposure and so on and so forth. But there is I think this is broadly accepted, that going in and being a doctor, looking after patients, does increase one's risk. Now, I'm not going to go into the details too far now, but the particular variant the Shailot generally took was of doctors who either themselves were more vulnerable than average or had immediate family members who were more vulnerable than average. And those doctors who are themselves healthy, in general, understood that they were no different to any other doctors, and therefore the appropriate thing, this is what it means to become a doctor, is to step forward and answer the call of duty. However, there were doctors who had unique circumstances, such as themselves being vulnerable, or immediate family being vulnerable, a husband, a wife, and children, or whatever it was, where there was particular medical circumstances that meant that they had increased vulnerability. So this was the Shailot that came in 7 or 8 different cases, in different shapes and forms each time. And again, I just want to share the general halachic principles that would be applied in this case. So first of all, what level of risk is one obligated to take? Can one risk one's own life to save other lives? There is a mitzvah, there's a halacha, an expectation to save lives, we've already mentioned. Lo samad al dam reacha, don't stand by idly over the blood of one's fellow human being. On the other hand, there's also a prohibition not to risk one's own life. Several pasukim, including the classic halachic source, which is in Devarim, Perek Daled, Pasuk Tes, look after yourself, don't risk your life. And this is Paskins in Shulchan Aruch and Rambam in the Gemara, that needlessly risking one's life isn't halachically allowed. So the whole area of risk is a complicated one. We all risk our lives every time we cross the road. And certainly if we engage in anything more complicated than crossing the road, if we paraglide, if we bungee jump, if we're climbing a mountain, almost everything we do involves a certain level of risk. I'm not going to, on this occasion, go into the issue of trivial risks and at which point a risk ceases to be trivial and is one that has halachically problematic. For now, we'll talk about risks which are more significant than the norm. Now, most poskim assume that if one faces a real high level of danger, and certainly a danger equivalent to the victim, one should not risk one's life in order to save them. And the logic of this is that in the same way as ein doichim nefesh mipnei nefesh, we don't push aside one life in order to save another life. It doesn't make sense to push aside one's own life in order to save another life. And therefore, if the risks are in the same order of magnitude, even if not identical, but there are similar sort of scale of risk, what would be the coherence of the logic of saying I should risk my life to save someone else's when the two risks are somewhat analogous and somewhat akin, and therefore this isn't something that's allowed. In the same way as the Gemara says, I can't kill A to save B, my chozis damo de doch summa tefei. Who says your blood is redder than my blood? Who says my blood is redder than your blood? And therefore, neither way would it be appropriate to take such a risk. So this is the general rule that would be used in equivalent level of risks. If it's a lower level of risk, then halacha leaves this open. It says it's a midat chasidut. It's an appropriate, an ethical thing to do. It's a mid of chasidus. It's a mid of appropriate spiritual sensitivity, but not an obligation. And if it's a low level of risk, then in general we would view this as a chiyuv. I can't avoid my obligation to save someone else's life without taking any risks at all. Lots of things that we do in life have risks, and that's the obligation of saving lives. Now, so this is one sort of a halachic criteria that would be used here. There are two other factors that are relevant to the question as asked, as presented by doctors. The first point is we're not talking here about taking a risk of my own life in order to save one other life, but presumably we're talking about risking my own life to do hatzalah derabim, to save many, because the doctor's treating numerous patients. And in that case, again, the equation shifts, because hatzalah derabim, there is the saving of many. Are doctors treated differently to anyone else in this halachic criteria? Now, on a technical level, certainly yes. A doctor, as opposed to a layman, has the possibility and know-how of what to do, and therefore has more opportunities to fulfill the mitzvah of Leisam and Amriacha to save lives. However, the simplest understanding would be that in terms of the obligation, in principle, they are identical to everyone else. Just the equations, the numbers we put into the equations will differ. They're perhaps better able to look after themselves, and therefore the risks are less. They have better potential to save, and therefore the benefits are greater. And therefore this will alter the sort of cost-benefit equation that we'll need to engage in. However, in principle, they are like regular people in that we would apply the normal criteria, just the numbers we plug in to work out how to apply them would be different. There are, however, a number of poskim that do not take that stance and argue that doctors are treated slightly differently to lay people in terms of the equation itself. This is something spoken about by Professor Avram Steinberg. It's spoken about by the Nishmas Avram, by the Shevet Halevi, Rav Vosner. It's discussed perhaps already by Rabbi Kiva Eger several centuries back, and by Rabbi Asher Weiss in more recent times. So this is something that the post can discuss, and a number of arguments are put forward why doctors should use a slightly different equation to everyone else. One argument put forward is that there's almost a financial or moral agreement with society when doctors are trained. Every doctor understands when they go into training that they are being called upon to risk their lives. Well, sorry, I should correct that. To take slightly greater risks with their lives than an average person just by dint of serving in a hospital. And it would be a bit like a fireman, after having completed fire training, phoning up to ask a shiur after they've completed their training, not wanting to take greater risks by entering a burning building. Now, again, this isn't a blank check. Everyone understands there are limits to the risks that a fireman or a policeman or a doctor should be called upon to make. But this is a suggestion that nonetheless, the equation, the risks that should be taken are different to that which would be taken by a regular person. So this is an argument put forward. There may also be an analogy here to expectation of duty, a bit like deserting a post. A doctor who has been has already got the role, may have effectively a position, a role that's been granted to them, which governments and societies appointed and which they have accepted, and therefore besides the moral and financial equipment inherent in the training itself, it may also be by dint of appointment to the role. Now, I would argue here that this is a little different to these classic cases. And the first point to point out is that actually the risks are unclear, or at least were initially, and even now are only slowly becoming clearer. We mentioned already many doctors did suffer due to perhaps viral loads and other things that aren't completely agreed upon or understood. And in this Shaila, in this case, there's the additional element of risking others, because the people that were asking were either asking for immediate relatives who were vulnerable, or they themselves had unusual vulnerabilities. And it's not clear that when one takes upon oneself the commitment to become a doctor, one accepts even when there are risks which are higher than that shared by other fellow professionals. The commitment is to do one's fair share, as opposed to taking upon oneself a higher level of risk. And therefore, in general, the ruling that I gave is unless it was a situation of immediate shortage, where there was a call and one's being called upon literally to step forward and save definitive lives in front of one, but was more part of the general call of duty to all doctors to step forward and take their fair share of the load. In that situation, if someone faced an unusual or exceptional risk to themselves, or in some situations to those to whom they were closely related, it is acceptable for someone to say, I'm different to the average, and therefore for that to be looked at. Now, I say this only in very generic terms, because clearly each one needs to be looked at the level of risk, and also are there workaround solutions. So maybe one doesn't need to be in contact with one's relative who's vulnerable, and that can involve, depending on what's going on, different levels of sacrifice and other such things. But in principle, the concept of risking life to save others is only when there's a relatively low level of risk. If it's a significantly low level of risk, it's clear one is obligated to do so. All of life involves risk. If it's a higher level of risk, it's a midas chasidus for most of us, but for doctors, an obligation. However, if one is unusual and atypical, then it isn't clear cut that this obligation would apply, and it needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So this was the second sort of question that came, and these were, broadly speaking, the halachic factors used to resolve them. The third question I want to look at, I share because I came across it in my learning and research, even though it was not a shaila that was asked to me. But I think it's an interesting and instructive question to look at, and brings out quite a lot of interesting elements. And this is a question posed to a number of poskim who I've mentioned already, including Professor Steinberg and Rav Schechter in Yeshiva University and others. And it's to do with taking risk as a patient or potential patient in medical treatment. So far we've spoken about taking risk as a doctor. This is a question about taking risk as a patient. And it presents in the literature in two forms. One is an ill patient taking a trial drug, and the second one is a healthy non-patient currently taking part in trials of vaccines. So in the particular case I looked at, these were students who asked about, there'd been an advert in one of the student, I don't say student magazines, but they don't exist anymore, one of the student Facebook groups, asking for volunteers for a trial vaccine. I believe it was a trial that was taking place in Los Angeles, as far as I remember. And that's the second question, a healthy person taking part in a trial vaccination, and someone who's ill taking part in trial medication. Now, the first question is pretty much a classic one in halachic literature, spoken about by poskim back to really back to the 1600s and earlier. A couple of classic sources on the matter. There's a Shavus Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reisha, born in the 1660s, Austrian rabbi. There's the Binyan Sion, who many of you may know of if you're of Yakish ancestry, who was the Rabbi Yaakov Jacob Ettlinger, a very important posek who lived in the 1800s and was one of the founders, perhaps, or the teacher of many of the founders of neo and modern orthodoxy, a teacher of Rav Hirsch, teacher of other of the prominent German rabbanim. And the basic principle is as follows. Normally speaking, if the patient has long-term prospect of life, chaya olam, then don't take risky treatment. If the patient only has chaya shah, in other words, they already have a condition in which deterioration is already occurring, and they're unlikely to live long, where live long needs to be defined, but probably somewhere around half a year, 6 months, then one can do a risky procedure if it has the chance of extending their life, even though the risk means it might shorten their life. So by definition, a risky medical procedure may shorten their life and cause the cessation of life, which could have still continued to be lived for several months. On the other hand, if you do nothing, they are likely to anyway not survive long. So in general, applying the standard rules of these halachas, one can undergo a risky treatment, or in this case, take risky medication in a situation of chayshah where anyway one is unlikely to survive. Again, each case needs to be looked at. How risky is the medication? How severe? How confident are doctors of the poor prospects of the patient? But in principle, this is the idea. I'll mention here a very important Ramban, who comments on the pasuk, or really the Gemara on the pasuk of V'rapeh Yirapeh. There's a very strange Gemara in Baba Kama. The Gemara is picking up on a verse in Mishpatim. In Parshas Mishpatim, we talk about damages that are paid to a victim of damage or violence, and the offender, the vandal, has to pay their victim for many things, including medical treatment. V'rapeh Yirapeh, they have to arrange their medical treatment. On this, the Gemara comments, Mikan shenitin reshus l'roif l'rapes. From here we learn that a doctor is given permission to heal. Now this is a very difficult Gemara to explain, because why on earth should we think that a doctor shouldn't have permission to heal? Were we to belong to the faiths that are skeptical about human intervention into the world, then maybe the Gemara is teaching us, you know what, don't do anything. Passive, God runs the world. Who gave human beings the permission to intervene with nature and the natural function of the world with God's given decisions? But that's not our hashkafa, it's not what we believe. Maybe this Gemara is the source of that. But either way, it's a difficult Gemara. Why should we think a doctor doesn't have permission to intervene? And the Ramban comments on this, that this is giving permission to a doctor to give medical treatment, even though inevitably in the medical process, a doctor will on occasion do harm. And no doctor can go through life and never do harm, and even do harm through carelessness or mistake. This is going to happen within the normal level of competence. I'm not talking about a carelessness, which is an incompetence, but just through the reality of the human condition. And therefore, doctors need this permission, V'rapeh Yirapeh, to give them the reassurance and the halachic allowance to engage in their important profession, even though inevitably they will, over time, on occasion, actually proactively do harm to someone. Now, of course, this Ramban is talking about a situation where this isn't a conscious decision to do harm. Nonetheless, the post can bring it as a relevant reference to the allowance to doctors to do risky procedures where nothing else is possible. The basis of the topic of chayei shah, temporary life, where there's an obligation to save life and yet more risks can be taken, is really a clash between two Gemaras. There's a Gemara in Yuma, Pei, which says that one can even break Shabbos to save the life of someone who only has moments left, in which case we see that chayei shah has legitimacy, has a value as life, and yet also the Gemara tells us that one can take risks with a patient who only has chayei shah to give them over to doctors who are possibly incompetent, since this is the only way of possibly saving their life. And Tosfos explains, as we've just explained, really, this is really the source of it, as I said, really going back 1,000 years, for the idea that one can take risks in a situation in which someone anyway is going to be unable to survive. So this is the classic halacha. What would happen if it's serious quality of life and a person wants to undergo a risky procedure in order to for a serious quality of life? That really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and certainly would involve informed consent. But again, this is a little bit beyond the remit of this particular discussion. So in brief, can someone trial an experimental medication? Leaving aside societal needs, which we will come to later, normally speaking, the rule would be just looking at their own condition. If they are in a situation where prognosis is not good, yes, trial it, what's the harm? even though if it is harmful, it will cause more immediate damage. If, however, it's a situation the prognosis is good, no, do not trial the medication. Why take the risk? So this would be the general halachic criteria. Now, the case of the student is an interesting one and an instructive one. The vaccine trial of the student, because there things are a little different. The first point is that the student is, or the person volunteering for the trial, there's no particular medical need for them. At the moment, they are healthy. The second point is we need to weigh up the risks of the vaccine. And from the conversations I've had, it would appear the risks of the vaccine are seen as higher than the risks of the trial medication that we were talking about. These are not negligible risks, though they are not particularly significant risks either. Thirdly, the trials currently being undertaken are interesting and different to the norm, because besides the risk of the medicine itself, the vaccine itself, here there's also the risk of the coronavirus, because in this trial they are being called upon to deliberately expose themselves to the infection. Normally, when vaccines are trialed, one gives the vaccine and then tracks over a process of years whether the person picks up the illness or not. And one compares their statistics to the average population who haven't had the trial and to a percentage of the population who have had a placebo and think they've had the vaccine but haven't had the vaccine. And that way you get the advantages of a trial. In this case over here, because it's being rushed through, they were being called upon to deliberately expose themselves to the infection, both because of time pressures and because the country was under lockdown, and therefore they wouldn't naturally, if lockdown was being kept, in most likely get the infection at all. More than that, everyone taking part in the trial only has a 50-50 chance of actually being given the vaccine, because another 50% are going to be given a placebo vaccine. And therefore, they don't know, they may be exposing themselves to the coronavirus completely unprotected, because they may not even be given the vaccine at all. So they lessen the risks of the vaccine, because they're just being given saline or something like that. On the other hand, they're increasing the risks of exposure. If the vaccine is effective, they don't even have the protection. Countering that, all the people chosen for the trial undergo a medical test, and they are healthy. They're chosen for being healthy people. In addition, they are being serviced by the best medical centers, and if they do fall ill, will immediately get the, not for them, is shortage of equipment. They will immediately be treated to the fullest extent possible. Now, I'm going to take as a premise that the answer to the question is not built upon the fact that there is an obligation of pikuach nefesh to involve oneself in this trial. In other words, it is true that such trials are necessary in order to eventually discover a vaccine and save lives. However, it seems to me that this isn't an immediate enough situation to describe this as pikuach nefesh. It's not saving life by volunteering for the trial, even though in the long run, we need all the thousands of people who volunteer for the trial to do so that the vaccines can be tested. So it doesn't seem to me that there's an obligation based on lo samud al dam re'echa, don't stand by when an innocent person is suffering, to volunteer for the trial. And I'm going to take that as the premise, much like we explained previously. Statistical odds are very far-fetched, even though we know that the history of medicine shows us that over years and sometimes decades of experimentation, eventually a solution will be reached, which will 100% for sure save lives. Nonetheless, it's too far removed from an immediate pressing situation for this to be viewed as pikuach nefesh. That seems to me a reasonable premise. Can they choose, though, to take the risk to help others? We again have the argument of potentially tzorech rabim, saving many lives. In this case, many hundreds of thousands, or even millions of lives, if this is a successful treatment. And here there's a very interesting analogy of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And this is one that actually I mentioned in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Soloveitchik of America, of Yeshiva University, on a different occasion, and it's a very fascinating analogy. And they use as a thought in this halachic question the language of the Gemara, of the Pasuk, when the Pasuk instructs right at the dawn of humanity, in the second chapter of Bereshis, instructs Adam HaRishon about his role in the world. And there's an interesting turn of phrase that's used, in which Adam is instructed to master creation, the kovshuha, military terminology is used over here, concrete. In other words, humans' role in engaging with science and with nature and channeling its energy and harvesting that which it has to offer and using it, the language of kivush, of conquest, is used as metaphorical language. Now, this use of language is an interesting one, and to the halachic mind, to the posek, sets a certain chain of thought going. And the chain of thought is that even though we speak about 3 mitzvahs as superseding our commitment to life, give up life to avoid merging someone else, to avoid pagan idolatry, and to avoid certain cases of sexual immorality, nonetheless, there is a 4th, really, to which the halacha also applies. And that is the scenario of war. Every soldier, by definition, in entering a war for the greater protection of society or for national needs, when such a war is justified, risks their life by dint of being a soldier. And the definition, the very definition as pointed out by many poskim, including the Minchas Chinuch, the definition of being a soldier is that it entails a risk of life. And therefore, to the halachic mind, when they hear this language of kivush, conquest of nature being used, it sets one thinking that this is relevant to risk taken in mastering creation. Now, all human achievements, every time human beings push boundaries, there is always a heightened level of risk taken. Clearly not a definitive, clearly not a situation of literal sakana, but possibly enough to shift it up from the trivial risk, which we already said halacha allows one to take. One can drive a car, one can go bungee jumping, etc., to a higher level of risk, which halacha allows one to take in a situation of need, which is generally a midat chasidut, but nonetheless, we said doctors perhaps are obligated to take, and those who are responsible at the front line of society's responsibility. We mentioned an analogy to firemen and to policemen and so on and so forth. And by extension, all pushing of boundaries might be included in this category. Every human achievement, the Americas would never have been discovered, for better or for worse, had people not been willing to cross the Atlantic and take risks. Every time we push the boundaries in our own world, or as we begin exploring space, there's always a level of risk taken, and the analogy to kivush by many poskim has been taken as indicating that perhaps the heightened level of risk can be taken, and therefore, again, with informed consent, this volunteer would be allowed, though not obligated, and perhaps even it would be ethically and morally appropriate, given that this is solo derabim, for someone who is healthy to volunteer for such a trial. So this is another, I think, application of some of the principles we've discussed with an additional element to it. I only have several minutes left, and I do want to move on to finances and just speak about a couple of the financial questions that have come up and that I think are important to mention. The whole situation has generated a lot of financial questions. School fees is one that's coming up a lot, with related equivalents, SEM fees, yeshiva fees, kindergarten fees, and the like. And I mention these separately because they're not all identical. Each one may have slightly different criteria. Then there's contracts. I have contracted to someone to do something for me, and I'm unable now to anymore offer them the job. Perhaps they are unable to come in because they aren't able to come and do the job, even though I would still want them to because of the risk involved. And even situations like cleaners, au pairs, childcare. There's a whole range of financial questions that have come up as a result. And again, I just want to run through some of the halachic criteria at work in paskening these shilas, though each case needs to be really looked at on a case-by-case basis. On face value, one would argue that if I have come to an arrangement with a plumber to come and fix the pipes in my house, and the virus now breaks out and they are therefore unable to turn up, that's their problem. It is true that they are unable to turn up because of the health guidance. Nonetheless, they are not delivering the service for which I agree to pay, and therefore I'm not obligated to pay. By extension, if I have an arrangement with a school or yeshiva or a SEM or a kindergarten or the like, they have contracted to provide the service to me. They are no longer providing the service. I'm not blaming them. I understand that they are honest. This is beyond their control. Nonetheless, they're not delivering the service to which I agreed, and therefore I'm exempt from paying them for so doing. So this would be the sort of starting point on a strict or dry halachic perspective. There may be broader factors that need to be brought in, and I say maybe, there definitely are broader factors that need to be brought into this. There may be communal responsibility to maintain our institutions, our schools and our shuls and our yeshivas and other such things. There may also be a parental interest in ensuring that schools are able to function, and therefore a commitment when one joins a school that one isn't treating this as a normal financial involvement, but this is becoming part of a communal with communal responsibilities. It's for that very reason that schools offer reduced fees to parents who are unable to pay. They're not treating themselves merely as businesses, but they're saying we are communal organizations who have a duty of care to the whole community, and therefore it may be that implicit in the agreement is reciprocal responsibility and duty of care to also pay back. Then there's the question of what happens if they do carry on providing a service. So it's true they're not teaching directly, but they're providing classes over Zoom and other such things, and therefore again, you get to a halachic judgment call about whether this is equivalent enough to the original service offered to say that they are fulfilling their terms, and that's the second question. What's clear is if I choose to take part in the Zoom services, the Zoom classes, for example, being offered, then I'm buying into this alternative service they're offering, and therefore my financial commitments certainly remain. So these are points that need to be said first, but intrinsically one may be tempted to think that this is fundamentally like the plumber. Someone has not provided a service for which we contracted and they agreed, and therefore I should be fundamentally exempt. However, it is not so simple, and this isn't the first plague in history or the first such scenario. And there's an important source, the Maram Mirottenberg, so we're dating back to the Rishonim, medieval Germany, the Maram Rameir from Rottenberg in medieval Germany. And he argues that when someone is unable to fulfill their terms, their obligations, not due to a personal situation, but due to a generic one, my contractual obligation remains. And again, the logic is as follows. In a situation which I don't provide the service promised, how can I make a claim? It's not about fault, even if it's not my fault, and I am honest, I'm unable to do it due to a health situation, for example. Nonetheless, I haven't provided the service contracted. However, in a situation where what occurs is entirely unexpected, could not be reasonably foreseen, and is something en masse on a general level, it could be viewed as saying we are both unable to take advantage of the situation, in which case it isn't the provider not providing the service, but neither of us being able to take up the service which has been offered. The scenario of Rameir Rottenberg was a situation where a Melamed, a teacher of Torah, was unable to teach Torah due to a communal gezerah against teaching Torah. And this Maram Rottenberg is brought by the Ramah, and therefore achieves its place in Shulchan Aruch, though there's much discussion as to whether we do follow this Ramah. There's various poskim, the Smar, the Vilna Gaon, and others who debate whether this is relevant, whether this is actual halacha l'maisa. There are other factors to be taken into account. The Gemara raises the concept of poel bottle, a worker who isn't working, meaning to say that it's not as simple as just saying I was owed X, and therefore if I'm unable to provide X and it's your problem, you still need to pay me X, because I get an advantage out of the situation. What advantage do I get out of the situation? I get direct advantages that I no longer need to provide the electricity and the heating and the wear and tear of the building and everything else that's offered. And in addition, I get the advantage of not needing to do the work. And people in general would be willing to take some reduction in income in order to avoid the need to work. And therefore, that also needs to be factored in that the person who isn't working is getting some benefit from not needing to work. How much benefit are they getting? It will depend on the nature of the job, how stressful the job is, the size of the salary, the length of time. People would perhaps quite appreciate having a shorter amount of time with a reduced salary and not needing to work, but not longer as it gets more difficult. The time of year, there'd be a difference between working in summer or not working in the middle of winter, not working the weeks before Pesach as opposed to the weeks of Pesach. They're in their personal economic situation. If they're living on the breadline, then maybe they can't afford to take any reduction at all, even though it will ease their lives by not needing to work. So this creates a more complicated situation. And by and large, therefore, in a case where genuinely no service is being provided, not a case where something is being provided by the school in the Zoom situation, but when nothing is being provided, such as a perhaps a kindergarten or the like, because of these various issues, it is appropriate to negotiate a pshara, a compromise, if one is unable to pay. If one is financially blessed such that one can easily pay, there is some level of obligation as per this Marami Rottenberg that we've discussed, this classic source. However, if one needs and is pressed to take a literal, to come to a conclusion, it is appropriate to arrive at some sort of pshara. And the federation based in has issued various guidelines and suggestions to that, and this will need to be discussed on a one-to-one basis with one's own Rav or with the based in, and obviously these are conversations that I am happy to have. Each case is different, but I hope that presents some of the sort of general factors under consideration. I think also, and finally I'll conclude with this, there's an obligation to behave in all such things like a mensch in a decent manner. And when it comes, for example, to one's cleaners, by government law, at least initially, they weren't able to come. Maybe that has altered, maybe it hasn't, as per the new guidelines. There's no contract, and there isn't a clear presumption of contract that neither side can terminate without notice. Nonetheless, it's appropriate to give something in order to treat someone reasonably and with derech eret. But again, this will depend on one's own individual financial circumstances. I don't think there's a halachic obligation to keep paying the full amount all the way through the period, particularly as per the previous calculations. This is worse because there's no contractual obligation. Nonetheless, it's appropriate to give someone something if one is able to do so. I'll stop there because I've run out of my allocated time, but I hope that gives a little bit of a taste of some of the medical and financial questions that have been coming up in this difficult time period. And I hope that the joy of Torah and the light of Torah in these difficult circumstances can illuminate a little bit the situation from a halachic and ethical and financial health model. I'm happy if anyone wants to ask a question. I'll stop the formal part of the shiur now, but I'm happy if anyone wants to ask a question, whether by chat or live.
Thank you, Rabbi Zobin. Can I ask you, would it be okay for somebody to give blood?
In general, the answer is yes. Giving blood does not involve significant risk. I'm not aware of enhanced risks at the moment, other than general social distancing and other such things. I don't know what the current policies are with that. But in principle, yes, it's something that gives benefit to recipients. It saves lives, and the risk involved and the pain involved and the inconvenience involved is not of a halachically significant enough level to mean that this should be prohibited. More than that, I mean, even this conversation can go a lot further, and under this format, there isn't the time to talk about that. But if we're talking about kidney donations and other such things, the questions of saving life by taking some risk are a multitude. Okay, we'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good day. I've just someone has posted up, Veronique, thank you, has posted up that the blood collection centres have made loads of special arrangements as they're desperate for donors. So let me take this chance.
After meeting.
Yes, to make an appeal. Those who do donate blood then should do so. Someone asked me what happens if the Pearl, the cleaner, the playgroup could have received an 80% grant from the government had they paid up taxes, but have not done so. The question was asked me privately, but I took it in public because it deserves to be mentioned. I'm not going to comment publicly on those that don't pay taxes. I would discuss this on a case-by-case basis, other than to say I know of no heter to do so, and I'll use this public forum just to say that everyone should pay every penny of tax that they ever owe. I'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.